And welcome back. We're glad to have you back with our session today. We're going to have a round table here in a few minutes with some of our great leaders from the North Central region, and they've been waiting for the opportunity to exchange ideas and to share with you. I do want to say what a great session we just had. I want to thank Chad Higgins and Susan Reno. I think for all of my colleagues in the North Central region who work in Extension, now you know how the magic happens. If anything good happens, you just saw the two people that make that happen. I just get right along with them. So very fortunate to have such a great team of colleagues who work in Extension engagement and do a lot of great outreach here at the university. So I want to thank Shibu, who is going to be my co-host in this session. We're finally going to be together, Shibu. We've kind of gone back and forth with others, but Shibu and I have had the opportunity to plan and to work on this conference throughout. So really glad to now be with him in this setting and look forward to this next conversation. So what we're going to do now is really have a conversation with some of our North Central region leaders. As you know, we focused on the idea of leading change and creating the future and really thinking about all we've been through in the past year and then how does that move us and project us forward. One of the things that I think a lot of us have realized is that a lot of the changes that were probably coming pre-pandemic, the pandemic just pushed them and accelerated them forward. And we're moving into areas of learning and how you interact with each other and Zooms and all the different technologies we're now using. We were probably headed to that in the years to come, but this has certainly moved us in a more rapid way there. So we're learning, and again, I want to thank all of you for joining us here at the University of Missouri today. So let me make a few introductions. Obviously, you know my colleague here, Shibu Jose, Associate Dean for Agricultural Research in the College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources, does a terrific job. And haven't said much about him, but his background has a wonderful background. I know he spent some time at the University of Florida before he came to see us, and is really his real strength zone is in the natural resources area, and was director of the School of Natural Resources here in the college before he became Associate Dean. So again, it's good to be with you, Shibu, and looking forward to this conversation. We also have with us today, coming in by Zoom, George Smith, who's the Associate Director for AES and Associate Dean of Research at Michigan State University. Look forward to hearing his thoughts. He serves as a North Central Administrative Chair for that section of all of our research colleagues in agriculture. Also glad to have Karl Martin, my colleague and Dean and Director of Extension at the University of Wisconsin. North Central, again, section chair for us, and does a terrific job in leading us as all the leaders of Extension across this region. Also glad to have Tiffany Heng-Moss, who's the Dean of the College of Agriculture and Natural Sciences at University of Nebraska, focusing in academic programs. She leads that particular section, so glad to have Tiffany with us. And then finally, Ben Steffen, who is the CARET Chair for the North Central region from Nebraska. So got a great lineup, people that we really rely on in different ways to lead, guide, facilitate conversations that continue to make this definitely, as I'm sure that Jeff Jacobson and that Robin Shepard would want me to say, the best region in the country. So we're going to just start there. This is our time we can say that, and looking forward to these conversations. So Ben, I'm going to start with you. You're our CARET rep, and I wanted to kind of kick this thing off with you. And let me ask you a first question. You've obviously have a great role in the CARET organization, and obviously the mini land grant really has its roots back to really preparing, equipping, and hopefully energizing our CARET reps. As you've reflected on this conference and as you look forward at CARET in the future, have any thoughts or reflections you want to share as we kick this session off?
Thank you, Marshall. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this discussion, and thanks to you and your colleagues at Missouri for hosting the CARET conference, and congratulations and thanks to the folks at the Lincoln University for helping with in their role with the land grant mission as well. You know, I'm humbled to be a part of this discussion. There are many folks in this CARET organization, and part of the pleasure of being involved with them is that they're successful and thoughtful and intriguing voices, and really any one of the CARET delegates could be filling this role today. So I think one of the most critical things that I've thought about during this conference is that leadership is at a premium, and it's never been more important than it has been in the last year and a half. I think leaders are, the paramount factor is leaders need to have some vision for where we want to take an organization. And that's not to say that the leader is the only person to develop that. That needs to be developed collaboratively. But it's important that the leader can articulate that vision and share that and carry some optimism with that. And I love James Baldwin's quote, "Hope is invented every day." And I think that's critical to keep in mind. It's a number of people have mentioned the challenges in mental health in recent times, and I second that. I think it's important to have a circle of contacts, and as I do, folks I reach out to, and those people lift me up. I think another characteristic that is important and imperative in these times is that successful leaders are honest with themselves and with others around them, and in particular, honest in assessing events and conditions we're facing. And blindly heading in a direction without being based in reality is a recipe for disaster. I think it's important to note that business leaders sometimes have an outsized influence in this arena because they work with all customers. And they're less inclined to go down a rabbit hole the way politicians do, for example. So sometimes businesses use that necessity for good and bring the political sphere back to reality. And I emphasize the word sometimes. I routinely reach out to respected leaders myself to help ground truth what's going on, and that requires listening. And I think that is absolutely critical to what the land grant institutions do. And extension's been mentioned in this role to keep the land grant mission relevant. It requires ground truthing our work and listening. So the last thing I'll say, I have 2 secret rules of leadership. The first one of my secret rules of leadership is there are no secrets, and it's all hard work. And the second secret rule of leadership is that you're constantly being evaluated. And that applies to CARET delegates, it applies to land grant universities, it applies to all kinds of leaders. So constantly being evaluated, and I will say that bad leadership, in addition to creating its own turbulence, has its own effects magnified during turbulent times. So, of course, people are constantly evaluating, and that's a good thing. Fundamentally, people are smart and creative. That is a great thing. You put smart with creative, and you end up with libraries, hospitals, vaccines, and cordless drills. If you don't put smarts along with the creative side, you end up with, alternate theories in a vacuum of information. And the land grant mission is fundamentally about helping people move forward. So I am proud to be associated with the land grant mission and the CARET organization, and I appreciate everything you're doing in Missouri to help further that. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, Ben, thank you. I'm going to go over to Shibu now. Shibu, you want to ask a question with one of our other guests?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Marshall, and it is such a pleasure to co-host this particular session with you. And good morning, everyone. And I'm going to direct my first question to George Smith. So, George, George and I, as part of our NCRE meetings, we often talk about some of the challenges that we faced as a result of the pandemic in our research enterprise. In a recent survey, 67% of the institutions surveyed reported that research was delayed, and 14% of them reported that they had to shut down their research entirely, 100%. Well, the pandemic also showed that ag research in particular was critical, and if you look at the research at our universities, we continued, at least in some fashion. It showed the resiliency of the ag research enterprise. So George, I would like you to delve into that a little bit and tell us about some of the challenges that you saw and also some of the new opportunities that the pandemic brought to the ag research enterprise.
Well, thank you, Shibu. That's a great setup for a few points I want to make. You know, the past 17 months have certainly been an exercise in resilience, and I think now more than ever, we have learned the importance of partnerships and relying on each other in the context of what we do. Was very pleased to be a part of the North Central Region Ag Experimentation Directors Network. We quickly pivoted once the pandemic set in to meeting weekly to share ideas and concepts of how we were each navigating through the pandemic, ramping up the necessary protocols and procedures for the research enterprise to be able to continue, and sort of getting them very, very clear message that our experience in Michigan was not different than our experience in other states. So I think we learned to rely on each other more than we have ever before. And my hope is that we can continue that sort of theme into the future. We talk about partnering in programs. We talk about partnering. Some examples we do well, some not. But the lesson of this is we really need to rely on each other. And there was certainly reliance, again, within our own university. When we got the notice in mid-March that of the stay home, stay safe order, and basically our campus was shutting down, we're very, very fortunate there was an exemption for food and agriculture. So we had to quickly pivot and ramp up the necessary protocols to allow our scientists to continue to do their work. And here at Michigan State, we probably had 80% of a normal field research season, which we're actually quite proud of. So the challenge to the future is how do we maintain the momentum? How do we continue to work together? Not as we continue to navigate the pandemic, but beyond that. And I think the other lesson in all of this for all of us is a lot of change was already coming, as Marshall referred to, but we also learned some new things that I don't think were really on the radar in terms of potential cracks in our food system and issues of the future that are going to have to be addressed, and that we in the Experimentation Network are well positioned to address.
Let me go to Karl Martin up in Wisconsin. Good to see you, friend, and want to bring you into the conversation. Obviously, COVID brought a lot of interesting challenges for all of us. Karl, you want to share any insights or leadership things that you learned along the way? Maybe some things that would be helpful to others participating today.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall, and thanks, Shibu. Really appreciate you hosting this event. You know, my mantra, and I'm sure Marshall has heard this, never waste a good crisis. That maybe wasn't evident at the beginning, but that definitely became our mantra maybe a couple months into this pandemic. And some of this has been talked about already, but we had a lot of issues in Wisconsin. Excess milk. Farmers were being asked to dump milk because there was a major disruption in the supply chain for milk, and also a significant drop in the demand immediately after the pandemic. So we worked very closely with stakeholders, with farmers, really provided a pathway for people looking for help and assistance, and then also engaging those new partners moving forward. George talked about this a bit. We really developed a lot of new partnerships that I think we want to continue forward with. Local government, this was obviously very challenging for our local government partners. We worked with them around emergency communications, also providing vital connection opportunities for isolated seniors. We can't forget that when this pandemic started, a lot of our fellow citizens across the country became very isolated in their homes. A lot of challenges, a lot of those programs were put on hold as well. You think about Meals on Wheels, things like that. So we really doubled down and make an effort on how do we reach those individuals who are isolated in a safe way during the beginning of the pandemic. Also really looked at new programming and new partners. So for example, with our 4-H programming, we engaged with 7,000 new youth participants that would not have engaged with us historically, that a virtual platform allowed them to participate. So there's a new opportunity and something that we need to learn from this, that by changing our platform and going with the hybrid model, that's not to say we'll only go hybrid, but by changing that model, we're engaging with audiences that we haven't historically engaged with, audiences that I would say we desperately need to engage with, that represent the diversity of our states. So I think a real opportunity. One thing we did, obviously summer camp's a big deal here in Wisconsin and other states. We came up with Camp in a Box, where we would have a virtual platform. We would send out camping materials to youth, for youth and their parents to use, so they could have the camping experience in their backyard. And we would provide educational materials via a virtual platform to those youth. Again, reached youth that we would have never engaged with before. Highly successful campaign, and just one of those lessons we learned. And just lastly, talking about the technology, our ability to raise everybody's comprehension around technology and virtual platforms out of necessity was a real benefit. Now everybody in our organization knows how to use Zoom, knows how to use WebEx, knows best practices. And I think you touched on this, Marshall. That would have taken us 5 years to do that. We did that literally in 4 or 5 months. We created training modules, et cetera, to train our staff. And I think that was really beneficial, and that's proving to be beneficial now and moving forward. And then lastly, I'll just comment a bit about meetings and conferences. We also did a virtual conference. I think we saved about $250,000 by doing a virtual conference. That's not to say we're going to do virtual conferences every year, but we have a different bar now around both internal meetings and conferences, internal conferences. Virtual is the default. Let's start with virtual. So if you're going to have an area meeting of 5 counties, say, it's going to be a virtual meeting. Oh, but if you want it to be in person, then you think about, okay, why do we need to be in person and how is that different? So we're anticipating probably saving between $500,000 and $600,000 a year just by going with that new model of, you know, if you have a monthly conference within your area, you know, 5 counties, that can be a big area. If you do that, you know, every other month virtually and every other month in person, or maybe it's once every 3 months in person, you save a lot of time and a lot of travel costs. And now that everybody can do it, it makes it a viable option. So I'd say those are a few of the lessons we've learned here in Wisconsin and across the region.
Well, thank you, Karl. And Tiffany, the next question is directed to you. So in your world, I mean in your mission area, that is academics, we have seen some rapid changes and rapid shifts in the ways in which we teach as well as our students learn. So can you, the same question, you know, please tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that we have seen as a result of the pandemic, and we are still going through some of those challenges, but also some of the opportunities and some of them new that you have observed as a result of the pandemic.
Sure. Well, thank you, Shibu, and good morning. I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of today's panel discussion. So far, all of the presentations have been excellent. And I'm going to start out by admitting that when I received the invitation to be a panelist, my assumption was that by this time, we were really going to be on the other side of COVID and that we would be preparing for a fall semester that was more similar to fall 2019, not 2020. But unfortunately, this is not the case. COVID has and will continue to be a disruptor for our land-grant institutions. It's impacted the way that we deliver on our commitment to provide our students with a meaningful in-person educational experience, the way that we advance our research and discovery mission, engage with our communities and youth through extension programming, prepare the next generation of professionals and leaders to be globally engaged and competent, and the modes we use to connect with current and prospective students, colleagues, alums, partners, stakeholders, and donors. And another area on the challenge that we can't lose sight of are the challenges, both personally and professionally, that our students, staff, and faculty have been navigating. But I'm always someone that wants to look at the glasses half full rather than the glasses half empty. So I'm going to devote my comments to talking about the new conversations and ideas about teaching and learning and student success that the pandemic has inspired. And some of the examples of this include the importance of being more intentional about building a sense of community and belonging as part of the student's educational experience. This past academic year, many of our institutions adopted a hybrid model that blended online lectures with small group discussions, experiential learning opportunities, and instructors have discovered the benefits with these hybrid options. And so it's something that will likely continue beyond COVID. Many of our instructors engage their global network to invite experts from around the world to join their classes, share their expertise, and engage with our students through online platforms. And that was something that didn't readily happen with the in-person model that was traditional for our institutions. Faculty also experimented with new ways to approach experiential learning. Cross-college collaborations increased. So for example, at the University of Nebraska, we launched a new 6-college interdisciplinary course where we explored the impact of COVID on Nebraska as well as our global society through different disciplines and expertise. New ideas about assessing learning outcomes and student achievement of the learning outcomes also emerged. Many times we think about hourly examinations, midterms, and the structure that we found ourselves in with virtual learning didn't adapt to those modes of evaluating students' achievement of learning outcomes. And so a very positive thing is looking at new ways in which students can demonstrate the gains in learning that they have achieved. The importance of our health and well-being program was also elevated, as well as thinking a lot about accessibility and equity among all of our learners. Recruitment has expanded to include virtual visits, and we've been leveraging social media platforms more strategically to connect with prospective students. And advising and new student enrollment models have also evolved. And some of those components will continue into the future. For example, all of our incoming students here at the University of Nebraska had the chance to either experience new student enrollment virtually or in person. And our advising sessions have shifted to online sessions because this has allowed more opportunities for our advisors to connect with our students. And we have ample time to be able to do that rather than the 15-minute sessions that we allotted in our in-person formats for those. So those would just be a few examples, Shibu, of some of the lessons that we have learned, some of the new opportunities that I believe will continue on well beyond COVID.
Thank you, Tiffany.
And Ben, I'll go back to you. One of the things you said earlier on the earlier question that I think certainly all three speakers since then have talked about is the importance of the land-grant mission in times of distress, obviously the pandemic being an example, but you specifically talked about the importance of the land-grant university listening and leaders listening. I'd like for you to dig in a little more on that, Ben. Talk to us about how we can be better listeners as land-grant leaders, because on this Zoom today, you've got the administrators from across the land-grant, you've got faculty, you've got a lot of us. Give us some insights on what we can do better to, again, listen better, therefore equip better our CARET reps to do the work that we ask them to do on our behalf.
Thank you, Marshall. I know that this is a challenge. We're talking about trying to connect with an audience. We're talking about connecting with stakeholders, supporters, funders, decision makers, and that's a difficult balance. And you know, I heard Chad Higgins mention several words that I noted and wrote down. He mentioned resolve, professionalism, and love of community. And I've heard other speakers refer to staying relevant. And all of these things together, I think, are critical. It does take a lot of resolve and professionalism. And I think those are, we're talking about the land-grant institutions and faculty and members engaging in this conversation with stakeholders. I think it takes Are you there?
We're here.
Okay. I think it's incumbent and critical to project that professionalism and also love of community. To engage people and to listen doesn't necessarily mean to get lost in all of the noise, because it takes a lot of resolve to sort out the priorities, and that's a critical role of leadership, to sort out the priorities and to focus on them professionally with that love of community. So listening, yes. Sorting out priorities, yes. And delivering, yes. You know, a political campaign tries to do all these things for all people and to project this idea of listening all the time. But true leadership and really connecting with a community is more than just listening to the noise and reflecting the noise. It has to do with sorting out priorities and loving the community enough to prioritize the critical issues and move forward.
Ben, I'm interested in doing a follow-up, if I could do that, Shibu, because you've delved into something that's, I think, of particular interest to all of us who are in leadership roles. There is this thing of listening and responding to what you're hearing and hearing the truth out of the noise. That's a piece of it. But how do you, I love your thoughts on how you see our role in leading people to something they don't know about, because people can only respond based on the concepts of what they have. There's this whole area out here where maybe there's new emerging technologies or new things they've never thought of. How does that, you got any insights for us of how that might best be shared so you can bring people to a different understanding or a different place?
I wholly embrace this as a grand challenge. I think, and I have employees here in my dairy operation, and I have several of those guys that I've encouraged to get vaccinated, and I've offered them an incentive payment. It still hasn't happened, and I'm, you know, I've scratched my head. I do think, again, I continually am impressed by the need for resolve and professionalism and courtesy. We have to meet people where they are. We do have to listen to those concerns, but I think we need to move on to the positive things that we are delivering, to the positive impacts. I dealt in a previous part of my life with enforcing an alcohol policy in dormitories on a college campus. And I know very well that it is futile to argue or try to have a conversation with someone who's inebriated. And but nevertheless, one can be engaged on a positive basis and make that exchange positive. We need to meet people where they are. We also need to emphasize the positive benefits of the information you have.
Great comments, and I'll go back to Shibu.
Okay, thank you, Marshall. Well, George, I would like to go back to you and ask a very specific question about something that I observed here at the University of Missouri. So in our college, if I look for silver lining, I found that our faculty during the pandemic were submitting a record number of proposals. Obviously, they utilized the time wisely, particularly when campus was closed, and we had a record number of proposal submissions. Well, when you look at our grants and contracts data from last fiscal year, we saw a major jump. So that was effective in terms of yielding a number of awards, and so we increased our grant awards by 45% last fiscal year. So that was a silver lining. Well, it could be, a number of reasons why it happened, but I would like to know if you observed anything like that, or if you have heard of anything like that happening at other institutions. So I'm looking for something positive out of the pandemic. George?
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. Certainly challenging situation, but there are some positives, and this same trend held true at Michigan State University, our grant submissions are up, our grant funding is up. You know, we went through a period of time where our laboratories were closed, so folks couldn't do that type of work. They had to pivot to teach their courses, but yeah, I think they embraced the challenge. I think they utilized the time that was available, and also probably had a strong appreciation and concern for how they're going to keep their graduate students funded to finish their programs, how to extend their projects. And certainly, at the time there were discussions about supplemental awards and things like that, but from a grantsmanship perspective, our folks did sort of pick it up and respond very positively. Our folks that help with grant submissions also upped their game and were able to continue to provide quality service at a higher level than we anticipated before. So that certainly is a positive from what we've gone through the past 17 months, Shibu, and our experience would be the same as yours at the University of Missouri.
Thank you, George. Marshall, if you don't mind, I have a follow-up, a quick one. So, George, you brought up the graduate students, and I've heard this a number of times, and of course, you can also read about this in published articles. As a result of the pandemic, it looks like it affected our early career faculty and graduate students disproportionately. So what are your thoughts? Have you observed any such impacts at your institution?
Yeah, very, very significant impacts on a whole host of levels. Unfortunately, we have had students that decided it's not for them anymore and have moved on to other things that likely may not have come to that conclusion if they hadn't had to adjust their program in the middle of the pandemic. We did go through a couple months where laboratories were closed and then were reopened, but it was all at the discretion of the major professor, working with their students and what they were comfortable with. So some students had a very short-term interruption in what they do. Others went for a period of almost a year where they weren't able to get into the laboratory and do their work. We've heard examples of students that dramatically shifted the focus of their dissertation research midstream, and certainly not casting blame on everyone. Every individual had to deal with totally unexpected situations, both the students and the major professors, and adapt the best they could. And certainly the mental health issues we're hearing about with our graduate students are also incredibly significant and discouraging. So we have done everything we can on campus and working throughout the network to minimize the disruption to the extent possible. But there has been a real significant impact, no doubt about it.
All right, thank you, George.
Great insights, George. Let's go back to Karl. Karl, you talked about some of the changes you see happening in Wisconsin in terms of now new protocol about how we're going to do a meeting for an area, or the new things we've learned in that technology. I'm curious, I'm going to ask you to give a forecast here. You look at the future, 5-6 years down the road, how's Wisconsin Extension, and for that matter, nationally, how are we going to be different in a good way? What do you see as some things that are happening that are just absolutely, this has really moved us in a good direction? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question, Marshall. I'll go back a little bit to what Ben talked about and having to meet people where they're at. And I think hopefully we learned that during the pandemic. So an example of that in Wisconsin that I'm really excited about, we heard from our constituents, our ag constituents in particular, that they needed more specialized expertise. And I think this gets into what the vision looks like for Extension. The reality is you can find a lot of information on the web these days. And we were hearing increased frustrations with our generalist model. Not from our county partners. This is really from the ag industry, ag coalition members here in Wisconsin. We took that information and we created our first ever regional crop specialist. It was a cranberry specialist. Wisconsin produces more cranberries than any other state in the country. And we created that position. And that was really working with one of those ag coalition members in the state. Again, meeting them with where they were at. They were frustrated. They obviously have a lot of influence in this state and other states. That cascaded forward into us developing a proposal for a variety of these positions around water, around dairy, around vegetable crops. And what we did is we drafted that proposal. We worked with our Ag Coalition, and amazingly, in the last budget that was just signed, biannual budget, we got $1 million base increase here in Wisconsin to hire these types of specialist positions. Some of those in our College of Ag and Life Sciences, 4 positions there, but then also 8 of these positions across the state to really work in those sectors, be very specialized, very deep within a particular area of expertise. That's taken us several years, but again, it's understanding where the constituents are at and what they need. What do they need on the ground? The extension of 30 years ago, when you go into an office, a county office, and you ask a general question, nobody's going to do that, or very few people do that now. In 5 years, nobody's going to do that. We need to be that leading edge of research coming out of our universities and being able to use that for on-the-ground implementation. So we need to be actually ahead of the web, I would argue. We need to be providing the on-ground research, the applied research. And that's why this link between not only our ag schools, but all our schools on campus and extension is going to be critical moving forward. And having that tight connection of the research that's going on and how does that then become beneficial to all the residents of the state. And I think that's a shift that we're going to see over the next, well, definitely here in Wisconsin, over the next 3 to 5 years, understanding that we can't be what we were 20, 30 years ago. We need to be the specialist on the ground. We need to be the ones who are training the crop consultants, who are on the same par as they're on, and helping them with what they're conveying to farmers as well. So that would be maybe one of the changes that we'll see. And I think the pandemic has advanced that. And just lastly, I would add, I don't think that's only agriculture moving forward. I think that's much like Missouri, we're set up as a standalone unit here in Wisconsin. I think that's working with health, and we've seen that during the pandemic. Our connection to our School of Medicine and Public Health here has increased significantly around vaccine education, getting folks out, understanding the science behind vaccinations. I will say one thing we've learned is that we have a lot of work to do to get the general public to understand the value of science. And I think the pandemic has really shown maybe the ugly underbelly of our inability to do that. The fact that there's 30, 40, 50% of the public who don't trust the science around the vaccine, that's really, really troubling. I don't know that we've ever had such a high, I'm sure we've never had such a highly visible example of that lack of understanding and lack of trust in science. And that's really concerning to me moving forward. And I think extension and our LGUs play a critical role in addressing that, not only related to the pandemic, but to a lot of to ag production, to small scale farmers, to water issues, climate, et cetera.
You know, Karl, it's interesting that if you, as some of my colleagues know, I'm really interested in sort of the history of land grants, and you folks at Wisconsin have a great history in something called the Wisconsin Idea, and which came around the turn of early 1900s when I think one of your presidents, and I don't remember the name off the top of my head, forgive me, but he had this idea that every home would be touched by the University of Wisconsin. And it sounds like that's what you're headed back to. Am I reading that correctly?
That's exactly right. So it was Charles Van Hise in 1905. So 7 years before extension was really created. And that's one of the mission statements for the University of Wisconsin. And our chancellor, parents were both extension specialists. So she really gets, and I think you had her down to speak at the university there, Marshall. So she's been a strong supporter of extension and understanding that we need to engage with all those. It's not just the ag sector, it's all those schools and colleges. And that's really where we're moving here in Wisconsin and across the region, I would say.
Very good. Shibu?
Well, thanks, Marshall. Tiffany, I have a question for you, and that's about the future of our study abroad programs. I, for one, have been a big proponent of study abroad and for our students to have that global experience. Well, I'm really worried about, what we can do as a result of the pandemic now. And most of the study abroad programs are perhaps, suspended at this point because of travel bans or restrictions. So tell us a little bit about, the way you see about the future of our study abroad programs.
Sure, Shibu, that's a great question about education abroad. And I will just share with you that our students are very eager to be able to travel around the world and have those experiences. And so I'm optimistic that once we do get on the other side of COVID, we're going to see those experiences continue to be a part of our students' educational experience. In the meantime, one of the things that we've done here at the University of Nebraska, because we are definitely committed to developing that next generation of globally competent professionals, leaders, and change makers, is the development of virtual abroad offerings. And so we had a faculty member that in literally a month's time developed a virtual education abroad in which he was able to connect with his partners throughout Africa and hold a series of discussions in which students could experience parts of Africa, not in person as we would have hoped, but still through the virtual platforms, and have the opportunity to listen and learn about the culture, to experience agriculture and natural resources through those lenses. And I think as we look to the future, we're really going to see expansion of the opportunities for students to engage in a global way. And so again, education abroad, I think, will be an important part, but we'll continue to have these virtual education abroad opportunities. And what we found is that they can also be advantageous. Number one, we sometimes have students that aren't quite ready to travel around the world. This is kind of a first exposure to them to experience culture in another part of the world before they actually maybe commit to going abroad for 3 to 4 weeks in some situations. And so we think that this is a good pilot opportunity for those students. We also know that sometimes there's financial challenges for students for traveling abroad. This is a way, again, for them to experience and become more global in their thinking. And it also increases accessibility. On the side of the global piece, something else that I believe will continue into the future is just the opportunity to be able to leverage global experts from around the world and bring them into our teaching and learning spaces. And this is really important because, again, we're focused on preparing the next generation, and we want them to be globally engaged, knowledgeable and curious, and attuned to diverse perspectives, able to communicate across culture, and possess a global mindset and an inclusive approach to problem solving and innovation. And this is more important than ever because we live in a world that's interconnected. So Shibu, to your question, education abroad is something that will continue. We're just on a slight pause right now, but we will be able to re-engage, and I think that we will be able to expand the opportunities for our students to connect globally.
Thanks, Tiffany, and I'm so glad to hear that you're also using the virtual platform to continue some of those global engagement, even during the pandemic. In a recent survey, 82% of the institutions surveyed reported that they were thinking of, in fact, expanding graduate student opportunities because of the virtual opportunities that are presented to us now and the acceptance of the technology as a result of the pandemic. So thank you. That's a great answer. Marshall?
We're about to wrap this session up, and I just want to thank George, Karl, and Tiffany for the wonderful job they've done, but we're not going to let Ben completely off the hook. Ben, you get the last word today in this session. What challenge do you have? You're our CARET chair for the region. We appreciate your service, your leadership. Have a closing challenge for us as we wrap this session up. We'd love to hear from you.
Marshall, I think the point you raised earlier, I have thought again about it, and this concept of listening to our community and meeting people where they are at, but being able to set aside the noise and prioritize our responses to the critical issues. I want to say one thing about this for land grants, and it applies not only to CARET delegates and our businesses and what we do, but all of us. And that is, we asked for these opportunities for leadership. I've chosen to run a business and employ some people. You folks have asked for these opportunities to help change our world and help change our communities. Now, we've asked for this leadership opportunity. There's no crying in baseball now, and there's no dancing around this obligation to respond. This is an ask for leadership and an opportunity for us to exercise the privileges that we asked for. So I think it's a tremendous challenge, and nothing to shy away from or to apologize for. It's part of that resolve and love of community that will carry us forward.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Shibu, for co-hosting with me. And I'll wrap it by saying that when you get that opportunity, it becomes an obligation then to lead. And you've got an obligation. I think all of us do. And I just want to thank all of our panelists again. Great conversation. I don't know that we've ever lined everybody up like this before. I don't think I've ever seen one quite like this. But thank you all for being with us. It's been a great dialogue, and looking forward to the next session. It'll be coming up here in just a few minutes. We'll have a closing address by Doug Steele from APLU, Vice President of the Council for Agriculture, and we just really look forward to that conversation. So take about a 10-minute break, and then come back and join us for that part of the session as we wrap up the mini land grant. Thank you.
Thank you.